Welcome to this edition of the Global Dream Circles podcast. I'm Lisa Gale, and I was thrilled to speak with poet, author, and herbalist Seán Pádraig O'Donoghue about his new book, The Silverbranch and the Otherworld. Those of you familiar with Celtic lore will understand what that means. This book, to me, reads very much like a song, a lullaby, back to the dream of right relationship with the other than human world. And I'm going to leave you with a little poem here from the book. The corn surrenders to the crow, giving its ghost to become the wings and feathers that will carry the seed to new soil. The apple lets go the burden of its fruit, which ferments in the fading sunlight, that the roots might drink it in as the season of slumber approaches. Fallen leaves feed the mycelium brought to life by the lightning the oak called down in summer. The king accepts the Cailleach's kiss and approaches the threshold of the stone chamber where all winter he will shift shape from salmon to bear to forest to man, and emerge again in spring to bring life to the dream of the land. You are invited to step through the veil of time and space to see what's in the dream time for you. Seán speaks of an ashling, which is somewhat akin to a daydream, and a really beautiful ashling that he was gifted as he dreamt there with the land in Ireland. Benachti, Agus Gra, blessings and love to you all.
And so for me, connecting with the plant realm and the fungal realm has always been an important way of entering into that Silverbranch vision. And when I speak of speaking with plants and fungi, I'm not speaking metaphorically. They are our kindred who speak a common biological language that our bodies and especially our hearts recognize. And through connecting with them, we can find ways of learning about being embodied in this world from beings who share biologies remarkably like our own, but are free from our cultural and historical constraints.
Mm-hmm. So, you said a mouthful there. I think it would be really wonderful for you to speak about your relationship with plants and how that's evolved over your life. And I'm thinking in particular, I work with a lot of parents, and we might talk about autism and what that means. And as you probably are very aware of, kids who are have nervous systems that are so highly attuned to the natural world have this automatic connection and communication style with the natural world, might find it harder and more challenging to have some framework develop of societal structures that make no sense to many. And so therefore their parents can suffer because they think they have a hard time connecting with their children. And so honestly, when I read your book, I just thought this is a way for parents to connect with the world that their children are so innately connected with, and potentially even a tool for connection with their own children. So, Sarah, look, I just said a mouthful too, so I'm going to let you just talk about your own relationship and, budding relationship, I'm sure, as it still is robustly budding.
Yeah, I really love that thought and I really love that question. So I grew up at the edges of suburban Massachusetts. Born in the 70s, sort of emerging more into consciousness through the 80s. And when I was very young, I was very lucky that my mother introduced me to the forest behind the house and to the forest surrounding the lake in the Adirondacks where my grandparents had a cabin. And my father introduced me to Irish music and to our Irish ancestors. Actually, my grandfather and my great uncle did too. My great uncle was the last native Irish speaker in the family. And when one of the earliest memories I have is of my grandfather taking me to hear him play his boscaciol, his squeeze box, when I was about 1.5 or 2. Uh, and so that was the very first music I heard played. And then as I began to come more into consciousness as like a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, it became more and more apparent to my parents that although they didn't have a framework for understanding exactly why it was, that I wasn't really attuned to this culture, and that feeling and seeing the way things were was very painful to me. And so my father taught me a lot about history so I could understand ways in which people had changed the framework that I lived in. And my mother introduced me to William Butler Yeats and to Tolkien and to Ursula Le Guin so that I could imagine other ways that worlds could be. Nevertheless, I really struggled with being in this world in this time. And that manifested very early in my life with severe asthma and breath as this thread that connects us to the world, and where my spirit was a little bit ambivalent about being in a body in this world. It was a bit ambivalent about breath. And that continued well into my 30s. And I also, one of the things about being autistic is that we can be either deeply in the world of the senses or deeply out of it. And when the world of sensation, the world of embodiment became too much for me as a child, I withdrew from it quite profoundly and really lived most of my life entirely in the intellectual realm and saw my body at best as a vehicle for carrying around an intellect and a spirit. And in my years as an activist, saw my body as something to throw in the way of destruction and not caring whether I was destroyed or not. And then by my mid-30s, my body was tired of being disregarded in that way, and my health was in tatters, my physical health and my mental health. And so I was deeply involved at that time in solidarity work with people in Latin America. And I had done some freelance journalism. And when another freelance journalist was killed documenting the uprising in Oaxaca in southern Mexico, I felt like I needed to take his place. And so I called out to Bridget, and it was very close to Samhain, and I was just a budding pagan at the time. But I called out to Bridget to show me the way to take on that work and to break me open. Reckless prayer, but so many of the best prayers are reckless prayers. And within a few days, I was suddenly being recruited to join an emergency human rights delegation to Oaxaca. And by early December, I was there. And when I was there, I met people in the mountains in a town that hadn't yet been taken back by the military police. And they were talking about how they were the people of the corn. And they were talking about how the elders could walk among the rows of corn and tell which plants were the ones that belonged and which ones were the ones that had been contaminated by genetic modification, and pull up the ones that didn't belong. And it felt so profoundly beautiful to me. And I also noticed there was a part of me that didn't quite believe it. Like my my colonized intellect was saying, "Oh, that's so beautiful. I wish it were true." While the rest of me recognized its truth. And then the night that I came back, I, for some reason, chose to go to a dinner party in Boston, which is not something I'd normally choose to do under the best of circumstances, much less when coming right directly out of place under military occupation and just less than 24 hours back into the country. But when I was there, I noticed somebody who had a different way about her than anybody else in the room. And when we finally began to talk, she told me that she was an herbalist. And she began talking about listening to the plants and working with the plants to help women regain connection with their own bodies and their own fertility. Um, and she is still a good friend. Her name is Misha Schuler. And I left feeling like, oh, wait a second, maybe what I saw in Oaxaca is not so impossible to access. And then I went back to Maine, and I very quickly became very sick with bronchitis that became pneumonia. And of course, the lungs are an organ that carries grief, and I was carrying the grief of what I had witnessed as well as the grief of a life of alienation. And on New Year's Eve, Misha called me out of the blue, and we talked for a while. And then after she hung up, she called back a few minutes later and said that she had heard my breathing and that she knew a plant that could help me, and that that plant was named elecampane, and that she had a deep resinous root and a bright yellow flower, and she pulled up what was being held too deeply in the lungs. And I went that day and got my first elecampane tincture. And when I took the very first few drops, not only did I feel my breath open, but I felt the unraveling of the story that my body was broken, that there was nothing to be done about that. And that was the beginning of my journey with the plants.
That's a beautiful story. And gosh, thank you for sharing that. I am imagining, so I am absolutely right here with you in that connection and relationship with plants. And I'm imagining someone who maybe has also, as you said, a very colonized intellect, listening and thinking, how on earth could you sense that depth of messaging after just one dose? Whereas many people may just say, yeah, I took a couple drops of something in my mouth. I don't know what happened.
Yeah. And part of it was the quality of attention, because I trusted the person who had invited me into this. And I had heard her speak of the plant as a living being. And I trusted that vision. I was open to the experience. And so some of the normal resistance to that kind of perception dropped in that moment. And from a purely materialist level, it's very interesting because our heart is an organ of perception. Stephen Buhner wrote a beautiful book about this called The Secret Teachings of Plants. And because our heart has the largest and most sensitive electromagnetic field of any organ in our body, it's the most sensitive to any kind of electromagnetic changes. So any change in our environment, it will register. And just as we register the light received by our eyes in terms of color and shape, and we register the sound received by our ears in terms of tone and pitch and volume, we recognize the fluctuations our heart feels through the sensations that we call emotion. and through the connections that the rest of our consciousness makes when those emotions arise. And so when you're taking a few drops of a tincture, you're taking some of the extracted chemicals from the body of that plant into your body. And plant bodies are very like our bodies, and plant chemistries are very like our chemistries. And every molecule has its own unique electromagnetic signature. And so my heart was picking up on that subtle presence of these molecules that I hadn't felt in my body before. And my tongue and my nose were receiving the taste and the scent they hadn't received before. And one of the remarkable things about our senses is that our senses evolved in a world where our ancestors were immersed in the realm of plants and fungi, whether they were in forest or desert or savanna or high mountains, wherever they were. Every breath was inhaling the exhalations of plants. Every sip of water had run through their roots. And every moment they were brushing against them. And so our bodies evolved to be very highly attuned to those signals and to recognize them. And when we're in a world of so much sensory overwhelm, our senses can become a bit blunted to them, but we can learn to attune our senses again. And the plants are always there to invite us into that.
If someone wanted to do that, because the world in which you live, that you so clearly embody, is the one very much like our ancestors, like all of the stories we hear of shamans in not just the rainforest, but as you said, our ancestors, European ancestors, North American ancestors, Asian ancestors. We had no medicine but what we could find on the land or in the sea. And it's just it's such a beautiful way of being in the world, and yet it's so very far that we've run from ourselves in that way as a society and a culture. If one were to take just an about face and say, I'm a little bit curious about this, in my heart I feel that there's a resonance here, but I haven't a clue how to listen to plants or how to cultivate a relationship with plants. Like I buy them and I eat them, or maybe even I grow them and I eat them, and that's the extent of my relationship. What are a few tips? I know you give a few in the book, so maybe you could drop a teaser or two about if you were to take an about face and say, I want to reconcile my relationship with this natural world, what might a first step for someone be?
Wonderful question. And it begins with the heart. So something that I learned from Stephen and from his partner, Julia McIntyre, is the practice of bringing attention and gratitude to your own heartbeat and the way that shifts our center of awareness. And it really is as simple as just putting your hand over your own heart. And it helps to actually put your hand there because we tune out our heartbeats normally. And so feeling your heart beating under your hand can help profoundly in bringing your attention there. And just feeling your heart beating. And with every beat, remembering that your heart has beat for you in every moment of your life, playing out all the rhythms of joy and sorrow and of love and loss, and of exile and homecoming. And then just let yourself feel gratitude for that. And thank your heart. And then just stay with that heartbeat. And whenever your mind strays, coming back to your heartbeat and to your gratitude. And when you're first doing it, you may only be able to do it for a couple of minutes. And then you can begin to do it longer and longer. And, they taught thousands of people how to do this. So many were amazed by what they experienced in the time of being taught it, and then never did it again. But when I learned it from them, I really made it a regular practice. It is so interesting because I fell out of the habit of that practice, except when I've been leading other people. And lately I have been called back to recentering that practice because it does over time shift your type of perception. And so then when you've learned to be with that for a little while, be in that state and go for a walk somewhere nearby. And even if you're in a city, there's somewhere nearby where there is one tree. And if you find that one tree that really speaks to you, even if it's the only tree that's in your world, even if it's surrounded by the sound of cars and people, that tree is still there in the world with you. And so if you begin to visit that tree, and every time you visit that tree, bring your awareness to your heart and being with the tree in that space. And then when you've learned to do that, extending your awareness and your gratitude out to the tree and bringing it back and forth between you and that tree. And as you learn to do that, beginning to bring gifts to the tree. And I don't know how the tree perceives the gifts, but I know how the tree perceives people bringing heartfelt gifts. And so many people in North America will bring tobacco. I tend to bring honey or whiskey or butter or milk because those are in line with my own ancestral tradition. And I don't know what the tree thinks of those things, but I know the way that I show up when I bring those particular gifts is different than the way that I show up bringing any other gifts. And that changes the quality of the conversations.
How you show up is what changes the quality of the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's profoundly beautiful, and I couldn't agree with you more. In terms of, if I'm reflecting as I'm hearing you talk about this on my own healing journey when I reached a healing crisis in my life, and that's very much like the practice that I would do with the trees, with the natural world. I didn't know why. I didn't understand. I just knew I needed to be outside amongst my kin, meaning the trees.
Yeah.
And humans were a bit difficult to be with. But, never were the trees so difficult. Never did they ask, much of me at all. But like you said, seemed to radiate the gratitude that I would show up with as well. And somehow I must have gotten rooted into my body in a deeper way so that I could actually do the work that was calling to be done in my soul and my physical body. We could keep talking about that, the physical, mental, spiritual benefits, because truly we are human beings and most people want to know what's in it for me. If I'm connecting with the natural world, what's there for me? What are the benefits to me in my life? So we might tease that out a little bit for the left brain, for the intellect, but then really want to launch into one of my favorite subjects, which is the otherworld, the Celtic otherworld.
Yeah. Well, and living in right relation with the living world and with the other world makes our own lives better. It makes them richer with meaning. And it also changes the physical world that we live in. So cultures that live in relationship with the other than human world, both the wild world and the other world, tend to operate in ways where they are more in balance with the ecosystems they inhabit, and tend to operate in ways in which their own human systems more mirror ecosystems, and so are gentler on people. Um, we've come a very, very long way, perhaps as far as one can come in this culture from that place. And now, with the emergence of artificial intelligence, um, entering into a realm of consciousness completely divorced from the sensory world and the living world, although not without its impact upon them, not without its tremendous impact on them through the electricity and the water and the minerals involved. And so we can make a choice. We can say, we're going to keep going there until we bring ourselves out of incarnate existence. Or we can say, okay, wow, from this far away, I can see how beautiful what we left behind is. Let's go home.
It's not a long journey either.
No.
It's
No.
it's a gentle turning, as David White said, turn sideways into the light or step sideways into the light. It's right there. It's a perspective shift.
Yeah.
So why don't we go there now?
Yeah.
Into that other world.
Yes, please.
What are some of the experiences here for us? What are some of the experiences that you've had here in this place, the other world, and this deeply felt sense of connection with all that is and never has been and never will be?
It's interesting. All that ever has been very present for me throughout my life. From a very early age, the oldest stories I could find were the ones that made the most sense. Both the stories of indigenous people of North America and also the fragments of Irish culture that I was able to pick up in an Irish American family in Massachusetts and in the corners of the library that nobody else went to, and in songs. But lately I've been thinking about all that will be. And I've been thinking about, so in Irish tradition, we speak of the particular moments when the other world is closest at hand, and those also being moments when beings of other times are closest at hand. And so I think about the year beginning in the darkness of Samhain, which mirrors the darkness of the womb, and that being the time when people would understand that their beloved dead were part of the assembly with them. And so that's the time when the people were pouring life from this world into the other world. At the same time that the living world is doing the same. If you're in a field in the time just before Samhain, you will see that the seeds and the fruits are falling to the ground to be buried in the womb of the earth, and that the plants are sending all of their life down into their roots. And so that we go into that dark beginning time, all the life from this world is pouring down into the other world. And so that was also the time when the word we translate in English as king, but the English word king doesn't really give a true sense of what a was wedded to the land. So the was the one who, on behalf of the people, wedded she who rules from below. And she was the one who chose whether that marriage would be accepted. And his life, which only later would that come to necessarily mean his death, only when people were more separated from the life of the land, his life became a gift to the land and the people. If you're living beautifully, a long life can be a worthy gift to give to land and the people. If you're not living beautifully, then your compost is the gift that you give to the land.
Well
and,
said.
so, and so at that time, it was understood that not only was she who rules from below um, the witness and the one consecrating and the one participating in that marriage, but the entire tribe was. And so were all of their ancestors, who at other Samhains had gathered together to perform the same rite. But I got to thinking last Samhain about assuming we all make it through this time in one way or another. Um, and while I don't know that our civilization will survive this time, I do think our species will, and I do know that our world will. Then likely there are future Samhain fires where people are gathered together, remembering the stories of the dead. And somewhere 100 years from now, there are those who are remembering us. And so if we listen a little bit more to their voices and pray forward the intention that they sing a little bit louder, then maybe they can help us remember how we got through this.
Yeah, you absolutely just said a mouthful there that goes way beyond this, desirous ego kind of dreaming the world into being that, unfortunately has become so popularized, right? And even spiritual circles to really deeply connecting with lineage. And as you said, that lineage that will come walk this land in a different linear time down the path when we are no longer, when this physical form is no longer and has either composted or gifted the earth in some other way. Maybe we talk a little bit about that. What are the practices maybe that could help us to, as you said, listen deeply and perhaps ask that the voices become louder, easier to discern in our hearts, in our minds, really just in our way of being is truly what I think that I feel that in my heart.
Well, simply its presence in your heart is the beginning. One of the things I love about the Irish language is how many layers so many words have. And so you might call your lover Arun, and that'll be a term of endearment. But that also means mystery. And that also means secret knowledge. And that also means our deepest intentions is our rune. And so in the Ogham, one of the kennings, one of the mottos of the blackthorn tree is Morad rune, exalt rune, make rune, enlarge rune, lift up rune. And so if we think of that, the familiar place to begin in the exaltation of that mystery, of that love, of that intention is the simple act of treating each being in our world with that preciousness with which we treat that which we love most. And so allowing ourselves to fall in love with a rose or an oak or a stag or a whale or a star sets that intention. Moriarty would talk about the importance of towardness. He would say, "What are you toward?" And he would say that his life was toward divine ground. And that's one of those wonderful things because it makes a certain sense in English. And then when you begin to learn Irish, you realize that there's actually another layer of meaning there that's just embedded in Irish grammar. Because I wouldn't say, "I have this book" in Irish. I would say, um, Tal Hour So Agam, this book is toward me. And so if we ask what we are toward, we ask what we belong to. And so what we turn toward, we begin to belong to. And so if we want to belong to the forest, we turn our attention toward the forest and we begin to belong to it. If we want to belong to our ancestors, we turn our attention toward them and we begin to belong to them. If we want to belong to our descendants, we turn our attention toward them and then we begin to belong to them. And then our journey becomes that homecoming back to that divine ground that we've oriented toward. And somewhere along the line, we realize that all those divine grounds, the divine ground of the ancestors, the divine ground of the descendants, the divine ground of the animals and the plants and the fungi, and the divine ground of the other world are all part of that one great world and all fed by that well in the other world where all our waters have their source.
That was incredibly meaningful to me personally. Just that story. I jokingly, but not so jokingly, became a grandmother today to a black lab puppy.
Oh,
Because my daughter and her boyfriend just got a little puppy. Puppies are, just full of so much gorgeous life, right? But however, there was something quickened in me of, the age that I am and this phase of life, the coming into recognizing that I will be ancestor,
yeah,
and there will be stories told about the life that we all lived here together. And what are the stories that we would hope that our descendants could tell of, as you said, how we came through these times?
yeah,
What did we turn towards?
yeah. And it's also okay when those stories are complicated and imperfect, because we also have to do what we have to do to get through these times. So I think a lot about my great grandfather was born either on my birthday or the day after my birthday, 100 years before I was. And, he grew up speaking Irish. He was in the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He came over as a very young man with a price on his head. And he was really devoted to his language and his culture and his people. And then the Ku Klux Klan came to Lynn, Massachusetts, and burned a cross in the neighborhood to try to drive the Irish out. And so I don't know for a fact, but reconstructing what was likely and thinking about what happened, similar things that happened in communities here in Maine with the French-speaking community, it seems likely that the reason why my grandfather's oldest brother was the only one of the brothers who remembered speaking any Irish was because probably the children were told on that day, "Don't let people hear you speaking this. Only speak English if you want to be safe." And so my grandfather, even though his mother never spoke a word of English, didn't ever remember a word of Irish in adulthood. My father heard his grandmother and his uncle and the woman from Cork who his uncle married speaking Irish, but that was his only exposure to it. But now my sister and I are both learning the language. And so it's taking on new life. And who knows what would have happened to my grandfather if he had grown up continuing to speak the language in public. Would we be here to be bringing new life to it one word at a time in this generation?
Absolutely. Yeah. Spoken like someone who's done some really deep reconciliation work with your own ancestry and the coming to terms with not only the choices that were made before us and the lives before us, but the ones we have to make now that are oftentimes put us at odds with the way we would like to be towards the other than human in the natural world. Yeah. There's a great humility and groundedness in knowing just where we are, and yet doggedly, persistently continuing to move towards, with hopefully as much courage as our ancestors brought to us. Yeah. I feel like I've been down the well speaking with Brother and Fasa, salmon of wisdom.
Good.
What I'd love to hear is any dream practices that you have in your own life, any particular night dreams, visions, any story that comes to mind that maybe is just memorable to you.
So interesting. Definitely, the more that I create quiet space at the end of the day, and the more I surround myself with old music and old language, the richer my sleeping dreams become. But it's funny, the few times I've told this story, I was always telling myself earlier in the day that I definitely wasn't going to tell it. And right before we began recording, you told me you had opened the book to the mention of Selkie. So here we go to a different kind of dream and vision story. And so this is less a dream in the sense of a sleeping dream, and more a dream in the sense of an ashling, in the sense of an otherworld vision. Classically, the ashlings were brought by the Sparfam, the sky woman, who I believe was the presence of sovereignty goddess of the land, who began speaking to poets in Kerry and Cork in the 17th century, at the same time that the forests were being felled, and at the same time that the last of the great chieftains were falling. Daniel Corkery wrote a wonderful book about that several decades ago, but still in print. But my own ashling was not of the Sparfan, but of An Farraga, a woman of the sea. Of course, now I hear Manannan's voice saying the sea and the sky and the plain are all the same. And having just been up in the air, flying back from the west, I saw so much how the structures of the clouds in the sky are the same as the ocean, and those are the same as the mountains and the plains. But this vision begins with a swamp. And I grew up in a house at the edge of a swamp where skunk cabbage grows. So eastern skunk cabbage is this remarkable plant that can grow up to be 1,000 years. They can grow to be up to 1,000 years old because its roots reach so deep, and also its roots allow it to very slowly walk. It can move from one part of a swamp to another as the place where the water is changes, and so that gives it this deep longevity. And interestingly, it's also a plant beloved by the bears who dig up its roots. The roots melt their own way through the ice, through the same chemistry that the bears use when they're awakening, right at the time that the bears are emerging from hibernation. And so they're going out into the frozen swamp, and these roots are the one thing that they can access. And so, coming out of their deep dreaming, they're digging up these roots that have been deep in the other world and eating their dreaming. There are also certain ways in which these roots can become a direct route to visionary practices. And having learned about preparing the root in such a way, in the depths of winter, just after Imbolc, so just as the dark of the year was turning toward the light of the year, I worked with skunk cabbage and went deep, deep into a vision. And the vision, my heart was replaced by a skunk cabbage flower. And I went down the route that led down from the flower to the root of ancient grief, to a place where I was a person who lived on land, who lived apart from my people in a cave overseeing the ocean, because I was one who was part of the dreaming and the visioning that was bringing the messages of the living world to the people. And my beloved was a Selkie, shape-shifting woman who could slip on and off her sealskin, who would come together with me when the time was right. And then the time came when both of our tribes understood that things were going to happen in the world that were going to be so alien to our ways of being that it was time to depart. And but it was decided that a few needed to remain and hold some little bit of the memory so that eventually the way could be opened for our people's return to the world. And so we both made that choice. But after we had made that choice, she saw how how much of a toll all of what was to come would take on the heart of this being who I was seeing myself as in that cave. And so she took his heart out of his chest and wrapped it in her sealskin and buried it under stones and replaced it with the heart of a bear. And then in that vision, I saw her switching the hearts back out, and then I reemerged into my own living heart now and into this world, coming forth from that vision, another spiral of coming more deeply into embodiment and opening the way. And so, the old stories tell of that time when Manannán gathered the people at the mouth of the Boyne at Chiddenbroga, and it was time for their departure. And he divided among them the deep wells and the ancient tombs and the hollow hills and all those hidden places. And those physical places are places of contact with that which was taken from the world that now needs to return. And last fall, when I was seeing the images of the statue of Manannán up on the coast in the north, and his outstretched arms were reaching toward the northern lights, it felt to me like a signal that, yeah, we're in some of the time of that returning. But the cavern of the heart and the cavern of the womb and all these other hidden dark places within us are also places where sleeping spirits hide, and where there's the possibility of that invitation. The heart is a she, the womb is a she, and what has slept there so long is stirring and waiting to emerge.
Yes. Shah. And 2 weeks time, I'll be there, and I'm going on pilgrimage to sacred wells for 2 weeks. And just as you said, some voice from those wells is calling. Yeah. It's been a while since I've been back, and this just feels like time.
Yeah. Oh, blessings on your journey and on the prayers I know you'll be carrying for us all.